standing outside the mahogany doors of the Meridian Global Industries boardroom at 2:47 p.m., on a Tuesday that would change everything, clutching my cleaning cart with hands that had scrubbed 1,000 conference tables, I felt something electric coursing through my veins. Not fear, though I should have been terrified. Not doubt, though everyone who saw me there would question my presence. What I felt was the crystalline clarity of someone who had spent 3 years invisible in the shadows of corporate power, absorbing every secret, every weakness, every lie that these executives thought no one else could hear. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The look on Richard Blackstone's face when I walked through those doors, set down my spray bottle, and took the empty seat at the head of the conference table was worth every humiliating moment I'd endured as just the cleaner. His perfectly composed expression cracked like expensive veneer as I opened the leather portfolio I'd been carrying, disguised as a supply bag, and spread out documents that would expose exactly how Meridian Global had been systematically defrauding its investors while I mopped their floors and emptied their trash. Let me take you back to where this story really began, because what started as a desperate attempt to pay for my mother's cancer treatment became the perfect cover for discovering that the most powerful people in Seattle were about to learn exactly how dangerous it was to underestimate the woman who cleaned up their messes. My name is Sophia Martina, and for the past 3 years, I've been the invisible woman who arrived at Meridian Global Industries every evening at 6 p.m. sharp, pushing my cart through the gleaming corridors of the 42nd floor, while the city's financial elite finished their power lunches and closed deals worth millions. To them, I was background noise, a necessary inconvenience, who emptied their designer wastebaskets and polished their floor-to-ceiling windows, while they conducted the business that shaped Seattle's economic landscape. What they didn't know was that the woman they called just the cleaner held a master's degree in finance from the University of Washington, had graduated summa cum laude with a thesis on corporate fraud detection, and possessed a photographic memory that had been cataloging their every transaction, every whispered conversation, every piece of evidence they carelessly discarded for over 1,000 days. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using my expertise in financial forensics to scrub toilets while men with half my education made decisions that affected thousands of jobs and billions in pension funds. But life has a way of forcing choices you never thought you'd have to make. And when my mother was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer 18 months into my cleaning job, the health insurance and steady paycheck that came with emptying Richard Blackstone's trash became more valuable than my pride. This morning had started like every other Tuesday for the past 3 years. I woke up at 5 a.m. in my studio apartment in the International District, made coffee strong enough to fuel 12 hours of physical labor, and checked my mother's medication schedule before heading to my day job at Seattle Children's Hospital, where I worked in medical billing to supplement the income from my evening cleaning position. The 2 jobs together barely covered my mother's treatment costs, but they provided the health insurance that was keeping her alive and the steady income that allowed me to send her to the specialists, who gave us hope that this fight was winnable. Every morning when I looked in the mirror, I reminded myself that pride was a luxury I couldn't afford, and that survival sometimes required sacrificing who you thought you were for who you needed to become. My reflection showed a 31-year-old woman whose hands were permanently stained with cleaning chemicals, whose back ached from bending over conference tables, and whose dreams of using her financial expertise to build something meaningful had been postponed indefinitely. But what my reflection couldn't show was the database I'd been building in my mind, cataloging every suspicious transaction, every coded conversation, every piece of evidence that Meridian Global's executives thought disappeared when they threw it in the trash. The morning routine at the hospital was familiar and comforting. Processing insurance claims and coordinating payment plans for families facing medical crises reminded me daily why I was willing to clean office buildings at night. These families were fighting the same battle my mother and I faced, trying to navigate a healthcare system that prioritized profit over patients while managing the emotional devastation of life-threatening illness. Miss Chain brought her 8-year-old daughter in for a follow-up appointment after successful surgery to correct a congenital heart defect. The relief on her face when I confirmed that their insurance had approved coverage for the follow-up care reminded me why I'd chosen to work in medical billing despite being overqualified for the position. Every family I helped navigate the insurance maze was a small victory against a system that seemed designed to exhaust people into giving up. Around 11 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Patricia Williams, my mother's oncologist. The lab results from yesterday's tests were in, and she wanted to schedule a consultation to discuss the next phase of treatment. The message was professionally neutral, but after 18 months of learning to read between the lines of medical communications, I felt my stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. I called the oncology office during my lunch break and spoke with Dr. Williams directly, something that still surprised me about Seattle's medical community. Unlike the corporate executives I encountered at Meridian Global, the healthcare professionals treating my mother recognized that family members deserved direct communication and honest information about treatment options. The news was cautiously optimistic. My mother's response to the current chemotherapy protocol exceeded expectations, and Dr. Williams wanted to discuss transitioning to a maintenance regimen that would be less physically demanding while maintaining the therapeutic benefit. The financial implications were significant because the new treatment protocol was newer and more expensive, but the insurance coverage looked promising. After ending the call, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, feeling a mixture of hope and exhaustion that had become the emotional baseline of my life. Every positive development in my mother's treatment came with additional financial complexity, and every financial challenge required more hours of work that took me away from time I could spend with her. But today's news also brought something I hadn't felt in months: the possibility that this nightmare might actually have an ending that didn't involve losing the most important person in my life. For the first time in 18 months, I allowed myself to imagine a future where my mother survived, where I could return to using my financial expertise for something more meaningful than cleaning supplies, and where the sacrifices I'd made would lead to something better than just survival. That afternoon at the hospital passed quickly as I processed the paperwork for the new treatment protocol and coordinated with our insurance company to ensure coverage would be seamless. The administrative complexity of cancer treatment had given me a different perspective on how institutions operated, showing me how policies that looked straightforward on paper became labyrinthine when applied to real people facing life-threatening situations. By 5 p.m., I was driving across Seattle toward the downtown business district, transforming from Sophia Martinez, medical billing specialist, into Sophia Martinez, cleaning professional. The transition required more than just changing clothes. It required shifting into the mindset of someone whose job was to be invisible, whose presence was tolerated only because the work I performed was necessary, but beneath the notice of people who considered themselves important. Meridian Global Industries occupied floors 38 through 42 of the Columbia Tower, Seattle's tallest building, with executive offices commanding views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains that could make even the most jaded professional stop and appreciate the natural beauty that surrounded our city. I'd spent countless hours polishing the windows that framed those views while listening to conversations about stock manipulation and accounting irregularities that would have fascinated my finance professors and horrified any investor who trusted these people with their money. The evening cleaning crew consisted of 12 people who worked efficiently through the building's upper floors, while security guards monitored our access and building management tracked our productivity. Most of my colleagues were immigrants from various countries, who took pride in their work while saving money to support families or pursue education that would lead to better opportunity. Maria Gonzalez, who cleaned the legal department on the 39th floor, was sending money home to Guatemala while studying for her nursing certification. James Thompson, responsible for the accounting department, was working toward a degree in computer science through evening classes at Seattle Central College. These were people with dreams and ambitions who understood that cleaning offices was a stepping stone rather than a destination. What made my situation different was that I already had the education and expertise to work in the offices I was cleaning, but circumstances had forced me into a role that felt like professional exile. The cognitive dissonance of understanding complex financial strategies while scrubbing the desks where those strategies were planned never stopped feeling surreal. My assigned territory was the 42nd floor, home to Meridian Global's executive offices and the boardroom where the company's leadership made decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in investor funds. This floor required security clearance that took 6 months to obtain. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story, during which building management conducted background checks thorough enough to reveal my financial education, though they apparently considered it irrelevant to my ability to empty trash cans efficiently. The executive floor was designed to intimidate and impress, with marble floors that required specialized cleaning techniques, imported wood paneling that needed careful maintenance, and art collections worth more than most people's houses. The boardroom itself was a temple to corporate power, with a hand-carved conference table surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than I made in 6 months, and audio-visual equipment, sophisticated enough to connect with business partners around the world. Richard Blackstone's corner office was the crown jewel of the floor, a space larger than most apartments with custom furniture, a private bathroom, and a sitting area where he entertained clients and conducted the kind of high-stakes negotiations that shaped Seattle's business landscape. His desk was always immaculately organized, with documents arranged in precise stacks and personal items positioned to project exactly the right image of success and sophistication. But it was what Richard threw away that revealed the true nature of Meridian Global's operation. Corporate executives, I had learned, were remarkably careless about information security when it came to documents they considered worthless. Handwritten notes about accounting irregularities, printouts of suspicious email exchanges, draft reports that contradicted the polished presentations delivered to investors, all of it ended up in wastebaskets that I emptied every evening. Over 3 years, I had developed a system for photographing interesting documents before disposing of them, building a digital archive that revealed patterns of behavior that would have fascinated federal investigators. The beauty of being invisible was that no one monitored my activities as long as the cleaning got done efficiently and the offices looked perfect the next morning. Tonight felt different from the moment I badged into the building. There was an energy in the executive offices that suggested something significant was happening. A tension that made conversations more hushed and made people more protective of their documents. Richard Blackstone's office showed signs of unusual activity, with multiple file folders spread across his conference table and several coffee cups suggesting a long day of intense meeting. As I began my routine of dusting furniture and emptying wastebaskets, I noticed that tonight's discarded documents were more interesting than usual. Draft financial statements that didn't match the numbers in Meridian Global's public filings, email printouts discussing strategies for hiding losses from quarterly reports, and handwritten notes about offshore accounts that weren't mentioned in any regulatory filing. One document in particular caught my attention, a memo from Richard to the chief financial officer discussing ways to inflate revenue numbers for the upcoming quarterly earnings announcement. The language was carefully coded, but my training in financial forensics made the implications clear. Meridian Global was manipulating its financial reporting to maintain stock prices while hiding losses that would devastate investors if they became public. This wasn't the first time I'd found evidence of accounting irregularities, but tonight's documents suggested the situation was becoming critical. The company was apparently running out of ways to hide its true financial condition, and the upcoming quarterly announcement would either require creative accounting that bordered on fraud, or honest reporting that would cause the stock price to collapse. As I photographed the documents with the small camera I kept hidden in my cleaning supplies, I felt the familiar mixture of excitement and moral conflict that came with discovering evidence of corporate wrongdoing. My financial training told me this information was extraordinarily valuable, potentially worth millions to investors who could use it to protect their assets or law enforcement agencies investigating securities fraud. But my practical reality was that I was a cleaning woman with no obvious means of acting on this information without exposing myself to retaliation that could cost me the job I desperately needed to pay for my mother's cancer treatment. The executives who generated these documents had teams of lawyers and unlimited resources to destroy anyone who threatened their operations, while I had student loan debt and medical bills that made me vulnerable to any disruption in my income. Moving through the rest of the floor, I continued finding unusual amounts of sensitive material in wastebaskets throughout the executive offices. The chief financial officer had discarded several pages of calculations showing how different accounting methods could hide quarterly loss. The head of investor relations had thrown away printed emails discussing strategies for managing analyst expectations during upcoming earnings calls. By the time I reached the boardroom, it was clear that Meridian Global's leadership was preparing for some kind of major announcement that would require careful management of public perception. The conference table was covered with presentation materials, financial projections, and draft press releases that painted a picture of a company desperately trying to maintain the illusion of financial health while dealing with fundamental problems that threatened its survival. The boardroom's wastebaskets contained the most damning evidence yet: a complete draft of the upcoming quarterly earnings report that showed losses 3 times larger than what the company had been projecting to analysts and investors. The report included a handwritten note from Richard Blackstone instructing the CFO to find ways to reclassify the losses as one-time charges rather than operational problems. As I photographed each page of the fraudulent earnings report, I realized I was documenting what amounted to securities fraud on a massive scale. Meridian Global wasn't just hiding bad news from investors, they were actively creating false financial statements that would allow insiders to sell their stock holdings before the true financial condition became public knowledge. The implications were staggering. Pension funds, retirement accounts, and individual investors who trusted Meridian Global's public financial statements were about to lose billions of dollars, while company executives protected their personal wealth through information that wasn't available to ordinary shareholders. My hands shook slightly as I finished documenting the earnings report and returned the original documents to the wastebasket where I'd found them. For 3 years I'd been collecting evidence of Meridian Global's questionable practices, but tonight's discoveries represented a level of fraud that could destroy thousands of families who had invested their savings in what they believed was a stable, profitable company. Walking home through downtown Seattle after my shift ended at 2 a.m., I carried with me the weight of information that could change everything for Meridian Global's executives, for the investors who trusted them, and for my own future. The woman who had entered that building 6 hours earlier was someone who cleaned offices to pay medical bills. The woman walking through Pioneer Square now possessed evidence that could bring down one of the Pacific Northwest's largest financial institutions. But knowing what I knew, and being able to act on it, were entirely different challenges. I was still Sophia Martinez, the cleaner, a woman whose word would never be believed against the testimony of executives with unlimited legal resources and political connections. The evidence I'd collected was damning, but presenting it would require resources and credibility I didn't possess, or so I thought. What I didn't know yet was that my 3 years of invisible observation had given me something more valuable than evidence of corporate fraud. It had given me detailed knowledge of how Meridian Global's power structure actually operated, who made the real decisions, and where the company was most vulnerable to pressure from people who understood how to use information strategically. Tomorrow's quarterly earnings announcement would be the moment when Meridian Global's executives discovered that their biggest mistake wasn't the fraud they'd committed. It was underestimating the woman who had been watching them commit it while she cleaned up their messes. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes from finally understanding what you're supposed to do with information that could change everything. My mother's appointment with Dr. Williams was scheduled for 10 a.m., and for the first time in months I was looking forward to a conversation about treatment options, because I could finally see a path forward that didn't require choosing between my mother's health and my own future. At the hospital, Dr. Williams delivered the news I'd been hoping to hear for 18 months. My mother's response to treatment had been so successful that we could transition to a maintenance protocol that would be less expensive and less physically demanding while providing excellent long-term prospects for remission. "Your mother is a fighter," Dr. Williams said, reviewing the latest test results, "and having family support like yours has made an enormous difference in her recovery. The stress reduction that comes from knowing someone is advocating for you medically and financially. That's actually therapeutic in ways we're still learning to understand." Sitting in the oncology office, listening to words like remission and maintenance therapy instead of aggressive treatment and experimental protocols, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my mother's diagnosis: the possibility that our nightmare was ending, and that I might actually get my life back. But I also realized that getting my life back meant more than just surviving my mother's cancer. It meant figuring out what to do with the education and expertise I'd been forced to set aside, and it meant deciding whether I had the courage to act on information that could help thousands of people while potentially destroying the executives who had never bothered to learn my name. The decision crystallized as I drove from the hospital to my afternoon shift at Meridian Global. Tonight wasn't just another evening of cleaning offices while executives planned their fraud. Tonight was the night I stopped being invisible and started being the person my education and conscience required me to become. The 32nd floor housed Meridian Global's Investor Relations Department, where teams of analysts and communication specialists managed the company's public image and handled inquiries from shareholders, pension fund managers, and regulatory agents. I'd cleaned these offices for 3 years without anyone acknowledging my presence, which had given me unparalleled access to conversations and documents that revealed how the company manipulated public perception while hiding operational problems. Tonight, the investor relations floor buzzed with the nervous energy of people preparing for a major announcement they knew would be controversial. Multiple conference rooms were occupied by teams rehearsing presentation materials, practicing answers to anticipated questions, and coordinating strategies for managing media coverage of tomorrow's earnings announcement. Janet Morrison, Meridian Global's head of investor relations, was working late in her corner office with several subordinates, reviewing talking points that would be used to explain away the quarterly losses without admitting the fundamental problems causing them. Her wastebasket contained earlier drafts of press releases that had been edited to remove references to operational challenges and replace them with language about temporary market conditions and strategic investments. As I photographed Janet's discarded material, I realized that Meridian Global's fraud wasn't just about falsifying financial statements, it was about creating a comprehensive deception that would allow executives to sell their stock holdings, while small investors continued buying shares, based on manipulated information. The really damning evidence was in the executive communications I'd been documenting for months. Email exchanges between Richard Blackstone and his senior staff revealed a systematic effort to time the release of bad news, coordinate an insider stock sales, and develop contingency plans for protecting executive compensation while ordinary shareholders absorbed massive loss. By midnight, I had completed my cleaning duties and assembled a comprehensive portfolio of evidence that documented securities fraud, insider trading, and conspiracy to defraud investors. The material I'd collected over 3 years told a story that federal prosecutors would find irresistible: a major corporation systematically lying to investors, while executives profited from information unavailable to the public. But having evidence and knowing how to use it were different challenges entirely. I was still a cleaning woman whose word would never be believed against the testimony of corporate executives with unlimited legal resources. What I needed was a way to present this information that would force action before Meridian Global's executives could destroy evidence or blame subordinates for decisions made at the highest levels of the company. The solution came to me as I was finishing my shift, walking past the executive conference room where tomorrow's board meeting would take place. For 3 years I'd cleaned this room while executives made decisions that affected thousands of people, never imagining that someday I might have a reason to be there as something other than invisible help. Tomorrow's quarterly earnings announcement would be preceded by an emergency board meeting where executives would present the fraudulent financial statements to directors who were supposed to represent shareholder interests. This meeting would be the moment when Meridian Global's leadership officially approved the fraud they'd been planning, making them all complicit in deceiving investors. It would also be the perfect moment for someone with evidence of their wrongdoing to make an appearance they would never forget. Walking home through downtown Seattle for what I suddenly realized might be the last time as just the cleaner, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years: complete confidence that I was about to become exactly who I was meant to be. The woman who had spent 1,000 nights emptying their trash was about to show Meridian Global's executives what happened when they underestimated someone who had been watching them underestimate everyone else. Tomorrow's board meeting would begin at 3 p.m. sharp. At 2:47 p.m. I would be standing outside those mahogany doors with my cleaning cart, ready to walk into the room where I belonged and take my seat at a table where the real decisions were made. The executives who had never bothered to learn my name were about to discover that Sophia Martinez, the invisible woman who cleaned up their messes, was actually someone they should have been very careful never to underestimate. The morning of the board meeting arrived with the kind of Seattle drizzle that made the city's glass towers look like they were emerging from fog, and I woke up feeling like I was about to step into a completely different version of my life. My alarm went off at 5 a.m. as usual, but instead of the familiar dread of another day split between medical billing and cleaning offices, I felt the electric anticipation of someone who was about to stop pretending to be someone she wasn't. My studio apartment suddenly looked different in the gray morning light, like I was seeing it for the first time rather than as the temporary shelter it had been for 3 years. The stack of financial textbooks gathering dust on my bookshelf, the framed diploma from the University of Washington that I'd hidden behind a houseplant, the portfolio of academic research that I'd convinced myself was worthless in the real world, everything looked like artifacts from a previous life that I was about to reclaim. I made coffee and opened my laptop to review the evidence I'd compiled over 3 years of invisible observation at Meridian Global Industries. The digital files were organized with the methodical precision of someone trained in financial forensics, each document tagged with dates, locations, and references to related materials that would allow federal investigators to trace the scope of the fraud I'd uncovered. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew how to look for it. Meridian Global had been systematically inflating revenue numbers, hiding operational losses, and timing the release of negative information to benefit executives who traded on insider knowledge while ordinary shareholders absorbed massive losses. The quarterly earnings announcement scheduled for this afternoon would be the culmination of months of preparation to deceive investors about the company's true financial condition. But what made this fraud particularly egregious was the human cost it represented: pension funds, retirement accounts, and individual investors who trusted Meridian Global's public statements were about to lose billions of dollars while company executives protected their personal wealth through information unavailable to the public. The teachers, firefighters, and municipal employees, whose retirement security depended on institutional investors making sound decisions based on honest financial reporting. These were the real victims of corporate fraud that treated public trust as a commodity to be manipulated for private gain. As I reviewed the evidence, I thought about my mother's cancer treatment and the months I'd spent navigating insurance bureaucracies that seemed designed to exhaust patients into giving up on care they desperately needed. The connection between corporate fraud and human suffering wasn't abstract. It was personal, immediate, and represented exactly why financial regulations existed to protect ordinary people from being exploited by institutions with unlimited resources and sophisticated legal strategies. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria Gonzalez, my colleague from the cleaning crew, who was working double shifts to pay for nursing school while supporting her family in Guatemala. Got called in for extra work this morning. Management says they need all hands for some big meeting today. You working the afternoon shift? I paused before responding, realizing that this might be the last time I communicated with Maria as a fellow cleaning professional, rather than as someone who had used their invisible position to expose corporate wrongdoing that could affect thousands of families like hers. The immigrant workers who cleaned Meridian Global's offices every night were exactly the kind of people who would suffer most if pension funds lost billions to securities fraud. Yet they were also the people whose invisible labor made it possible for executives to conduct their business in environments that projected success and sophistication. Working today, I texted back. But things might be different after this afternoon. The morning at Seattle Children's Hospital passed in a blur of processing insurance claims and coordinating payment plans for families dealing with medical crises that had upended their financial planning. Every conversation reminded me why I had spent 3 years accepting a situation that felt like professional exile, because sometimes survival required sacrificing who you thought you were for who you needed to become, to protect the people you loved. Mrs. Patterson brought her 12-year-old son in for follow-up care after successful treatment for a rare kidney condition that would have been fatal without immediate intervention. The relief on her face when I confirmed that their insurance would cover the ongoing monitoring he needed reminded me that institutional systems could work for families when people with expertise advocated for patients who didn't understand how to navigate complex bureaucracy. "You saved our lives," Mrs. Patterson said as she gathered her son's medical records. "Not just medically, but financially. We would have gone bankrupt trying to figure out these insurance requirements on our own. Her words hit me with unexpected force because they articulated exactly why I'd been willing to work two jobs that felt beneath my education and expertise. Every family I helped navigate the healthcare system represented a small victory against institutions that prioritized profit over people, and every successful insurance claim was proof that expertise applied with compassion could make the difference between hope and despair for families facing impossible circumstances. But today, I realized that helping individual families navigate corrupt systems wasn't enough when I had evidence that could expose the institutional corruption affecting thousands of families who didn't even know they were being victimized. The same analytical skills that helped me untangle insurance bureaucracies had revealed corporate fraud that threatened the retirement security of teachers, police officers, and municipal employees whose pension funds trusted Meridian Global's financial statement. Around noon, I received a call from Dr. Williams with an update about my mother's treatment progress that crystallized my decision to act on the evidence I'd collected. The maintenance therapy protocol was working better than anyone had expected, and my mother's prognosis now included words like full remission and normal life expectancy that we hadn't dared to hope for 18 months ago. Your mother wants to talk about returning to work part-time, Doc Williams said. She's feeling strong enough to resume some of her normal activities, and maintaining social connections and professional purpose is actually therapeutic for patients in her situation. For the first time since my mother's diagnosis, I could imagine a future where medical bills and insurance requirements didn't dominate every decision we made. The financial pressure that had forced me to accept work beneath my qualifications was finally easing, which meant I could afford to take the professional risks that came with exposing corporate fraud. But more importantly, my mother's recovery gave me something I'd lost during the darkest months of her treatment: faith that doing the right thing, even when it required enormous sacrifice, could lead to outcomes better than mere survival. If she could fight cancer and win, I could fight corporate fraud and win too. After finishing my hospital shift, I drove home to prepare for what would either be the most important afternoon of my career or a spectacular professional suicide that would leave me unemployable in Seattle's financial industry. The woman who had spent 3 years invisible in corporate corridors was about to become very visible to people who possessed unlimited resources for destroying anyone who threatened their operation. I selected my outfit with the same strategic thinking I'd applied to collecting evidence of securities fraud. The navy blue suit I'd worn to job interviews before my mother's diagnosis, the simple jewelry that projected competence without ostentation, the briefcase that had carried my thesis research on corporate fraud detection and would today carry evidence of actual corporate fraud. Looking in the mirror, I saw someone who belonged in boardrooms and executive offices, someone whose expertise in financial forensics was worth more than the cleaning contracts that had paid for my mother's cancer treatment. For 3 years, I'd hidden this version of myself behind cleaning uniforms and invisible labor, but this afternoon I would reclaim the professional identity I'd been forced to abandon. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and I answered to hear a woman's voice that sounded official and slightly nervous. "Miss Martinez, this is Jennifer Walsh from the Securities and Exchange Commission's Seattle field office. We understand you may have information relevant to our ongoing investigation of Meridian Global Industries." The call caught me completely off guard. I'd spent months planning how to present my evidence to authorities who would take it seriously, but I'd never contacted the SEC directly. Someone else had apparently identified me as a potential source of information about Meridian Global's operations. "I might have some information that would be useful," I said carefully, "but I'd prefer to discuss this in person rather than over the phone. We can arrange a meeting this afternoon if you're available," Jennifer Walsh continued. "Our investigation has reached a point where we need additional evidence to support potential criminal charges, and we believe you may have access to materials that could be crucial to our case." Criminal charge. The phrase sent adrenaline coursing through my system as I realized that federal investigators were already building a case against Meridian Global's executive. My evidence wouldn't just be helpful, it could be the documentation that transformed a regulatory investigation into criminal prosecution that would result in prison sentences for people who had stolen billions from ordinary investors. "I can meet this afternoon," But first, I have something I need to do at Meridian Global's offices. The afternoon drive to downtown Seattle felt like traveling toward a completely different version of my future. The woman behind the wheel had spent 1,000 nights cleaning offices while corporate executives planned fraud that would devastate families across the Pacific Northwest. The woman who would walk into that boardroom in 2 hours would be someone those executives had never imagined, a financial forensics expert with evidence that could destroy their careers and send them to federal prison. I parked in the Columbia Towers visitor garage and took the elevator to the 42nd floor, where I'd spent 3 years polishing conference tables and emptying waste baskets, while absorbing every detail of how Meridian Global's power structure actually operated. Today, I would use that knowledge to walk into the boardroom where the company's leadership was about to approve fraudulent financial statements, and I would take my seat at the table where real decisions were made. The executive floor buzzed with nervous energy as staff prepared for the board meeting that would officially authorize the quarterly earnings announcement. Richard Blackstone's assistant was coordinating with audio-visual technicians to ensure the presentation materials would display properly, while junior executives rehearsed answers to anticipated questions about the company's financial performance. None of them noticed the woman in the navy blue suit who walked past their offices with the confident stride of someone who belonged in executive corridor. For 3 years they'd trained themselves not to see me, and that invisible training made it remarkably easy to move through their workspace without attracting attention. The boardroom doors were closed, but I could hear voices inside discussing final preparations for the meeting that would begin in 15 minutes. Through the glass panels, I could see Richard Blackstone arranging presentation materials while other executives tested the microphone system and adjusted lighting for the video conference connection that would allow remote board members to participate. I positioned myself in the hallway where I could observe the boardroom entrance while appearing to wait for someone, just another professional visiting Meridian Global's executive offices for legitimate business purposes. My briefcase contained 3 years of evidence that could transform this afternoon's board meeting from a routine approval of financial statements into the moment when executives realized their systematic fraud had been discovered by someone they'd never bothered to acknowledge. At 2:55 p.m., board members began arriving for the 3 o'clock meeting. Distinguished men and women in expensive suits carrying leather portfolios and projecting the authority that came with overseeing billion-dollar corporations and managing institutional investments that affected thousands of families. These were people who served on multiple boards, managed pension funds, and made decisions that shaped the retirement security of teachers, firefighters, and municipal employees across the Pacific Northwest. What they didn't know was that the quarterly earnings report they were about to approve contained fraudulent information that would allow Meridian Global's executives to sell their stock holdings while pension funds absorbed massive losses based on manipulated financial statements. At 2:58 p.m., Richard Blackstone emerged from the boardroom to greet the final board members arriving for the meeting. His expression projected the confidence of someone who had spent weeks preparing a presentation designed to deceive institutional investors while protecting his personal wealth through insider information. At 2:59 p.m., I straightened my jacket, picked up my briefcase, and walked toward the boardroom doors with the purposeful stride of someone who had every right to be there. Richard Blackstone's face went through a series of expressions as I approached: confusion about who I was, recognition that I looked familiar, and dawning horror as he realized that the woman walking toward his boardroom was someone he'd seen 1,000 times but never actually known. "Excuse me," he said, moving to block my path. "This is a private board meeting. You can't just walk in here." "Actually, I can," I replied, continuing toward the doors with the confidence of someone who had spent 3 years studying exactly how Meridian Global's power structure operated. "My name is Sophia Martinez, and I have information that this board needs to hear before approving today's quarterly earnings announcement." The boardroom fell silent as I entered and took the empty chair at the conference table, the same table I'd polished countless times while executives discussed strategies for manipulating financial reports. The board members stared at me with the bewilderment of people trying to process an interruption they hadn't anticipated, while Richard Blackstone's face displayed the kind of panic that comes from realizing your carefully constructed deception is about to be exposed. "Ladies and gentlemen, Opening my briefcase and removing the portfolio of evidence I'd compiled over 3 years of invisible observation. I have documentation that the quarterly earnings report you're about to approve contains fraudulent information designed to deceive investors, while allowing company executives to profit from insider knowledge. The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when people realize their understanding of a situation was completely wrong. Board members looked from me to Richard Blackstone to each other, trying to process how someone they didn't recognize had walked into their private meeting with accusations of securities fraud. "Who exactly are you?" asked Margaret Williamson, the board's lead independent director, with the authority of someone accustomed to managing corporate crises. "For the past 3 years, I've worked as a cleaning professional in this building, which has given me access to executive offices, confidential documents, and conversations that revealed systematic efforts to manipulate Meridian Global's financial reporting. You're the cleaning lady." Richard Blackstone's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and barely controlled fury. "You can't just barge into a board meeting and make wild accusations. Security will escort you out immediately." "Actually," I said, remaining seated while opening my portfolio, "I'm a financial forensics expert with a master's degree in finance from the University of Washington. And these aren't wild accusations. They're documented facts about securities fraud that federal investigators are already investigating." The transformation in the room was immediate and profound. Board members who had been prepared to approve routine financial statements suddenly found themselves confronting evidence of corporate fraud that could result in criminal charges, massive investor lawsuits, and personal liability for directors who failed to exercise appropriate oversight. Margaret Williamson leaned forward, her expression shifting from confusion to the sharp focus of someone who had spent decades managing institutional investments and understood exactly what securities fraud meant for board members who approved fraudulent financial statements. "What kind of documentation do you have?" she asked. I began spreading documents across the conference table, the same table where I'd emptied wastebaskets containing evidence of the fraud I was now exposing. Handwritten notes from Richard Blackstone instructing subordinates to hide quarterly losses, email printouts discussing strategies for timing the release of negative information, draft financial statements that contradicted the numbers in today's earnings announcement. Each document told part of a story that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic fraud designed to deceive investors while protecting executive wealth. The board members examined the materials with growing alarm, recognizing the legal and financial implications of approving earnings statements that they now understood were deliberately falsified. "This is a complete set of accounting records that show Meridian Global's actual financial performance," I continued, handing Margaret Williamson a folder containing the real numbers behind the company's manipulated report. "The losses you're about to announce as temporary market adjustments are actually operational problems that have been developing for over a year." Richard Blackstone attempted to regain control of the situation with the aggressive confidence that had probably served him well in previous corporate crises. "This is clearly some kind of extortion attempt," he said. "This woman is trying to manipulate board deliberations using documents that could be fabricated or taken out of context." Margaret Williamson held up her hand to silence him while continuing to review the evidence I'd present. Her experience managing institutional investments had clearly taught her to recognize authentic financial documents, and her expression suggested she understood exactly what she was seeing. "These appear to be genuine internal documents," she said, "and if they're accurate, they indicate systematic efforts to mislead investors about this company's financial condition." Other board members began examining the materials with the growing realization that they had been invited to a meeting where they would unknowingly approve fraudulent financial statements that could expose them to personal liability for failing to exercise proper oversight of corporate management. Dr. Patricia Chen, who served on the board as a representative of the pension fund that managed retirement benefits for Seattle's municipal employees, looked up from the documents with obvious alarm. "If these earnings statements are fraudulent, thousands of pension beneficiaries could lose their retirement security based on investment decisions made with false information." Her words crystallized exactly why I had decided to risk my career and personal safety to expose Meridian Global's fraud. The teachers, firefighters, and municipal employees, whose retirement funds trusted institutional investors to make sound decisions based on honest financial reporting, These were the real victims of corporate deception that treated public trust as a commodity to be manipulated for private gain. I have additional evidence, I said, removing a tablet from my briefcase and displaying a comprehensive database of suspicious transactions I'd documented over 3 years. This shows patterns of insider trading that allowed executives to sell stock holdings before negative information became public, while ordinary shareholders continued buying shares based on manipulated earnings reports. The reaction was immediate and decisive. Board members began making phone calls to legal counsel and regulatory authorities, while Margaret Williamson assumed control of the meeting with the authority of someone who understood that corporate governance required immediate action when evidence of fraud was presented. This board meeting is suspended pending a complete investigation of these allegations, she announced. Richard, you are relieved of your duties effective immediately, and all executive stock transactions are frozen until federal authorities can review this evidence. Richard Blackstone's expression shifted from confident aggression to desperate calculation, as he realized that his carefully planned fraud had been exposed by someone he'd never considered a threat. The woman he'd seen emptying his wastebasket every night for 3 years had documented evidence that would probably send him to federal prison while destroying the corporate empire he'd spent decades building. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, looking directly at me with the kind of personal hatred that comes from being outmaneuvered by someone you'd considered beneath notice. "This company employs thousands of people whose jobs depend on maintaining investor confidence." "What I understand," I replied, "is that investor confidence based on fraudulent information isn't worth protecting, and that thousands of families depend on honest financial reporting to make retirement planning decisions that affect their economic security for decades." The board moved quickly to contain the crisis with the efficiency of people who understood that every minute of delay increased their personal liability and the potential damage to investors who trusted Meridian Global's financial statement. Legal counsel was contacted, federal authorities were notified, and emergency protocols were implemented to prevent the destruction of evidence that could be crucial to criminal prosecution. Within an hour, the Securities and Exchange Commission had investigators on site reviewing the documentation I'd provided and coordinating with federal prosecutors who were already building a case against Meridian Global's executive. The quarterly earnings announcement was canceled, trading in the company's stock was suspended, and Richard Blackstone was escorted from the building by federal agents who informed him that he was a target of a criminal investigation. As the boardroom emptied and investigators began the process of securing evidence, Margaret Williamson approached me with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something extraordinary. "You've probably saved thousands of families from losing their retirement security," she said, "but you've also put yourself at considerable personal risk by exposing fraud at this level. The company will provide legal protection and financial compensation for your cooperation with federal authorities." I looked around the boardroom where I had spent 3 years polishing conference tables while executives planned the fraud I had just exposed, feeling something I hadn't experienced since my mother's cancer diagnosis: complete certainty that I had made decisions based on principle rather than "I didn't do this for compensation," I replied. "I did it because financial fraud hurts ordinary families who trust institutional systems to protect their economic security, and because someone with the expertise to recognize fraud has a responsibility to expose it when they encounter it." As I walked out of Meridian Global Industries for the last time, carrying my briefcase and wearing the navy blue suit that proclaimed my qualifications to work in boardrooms rather than clean them, I felt the satisfaction of someone who had reclaimed not just her professional identity but her sense of purpose. The woman who entered that building 3 years ago as a desperate job applicant willing to accept work beneath her qualifications was leaving as someone who had used her education and expertise to protect thousands of families from corporate fraud that would have devastated their financial security. Tomorrow, I would meet with federal prosecutors to provide detailed testimony about the evidence I'd collected over 3 years of invisible observation. Next week, I would begin working as a consultant helping other institutional investors identify potential fraud in corporate financial statements. But today, I was simply Sophia Martinez, walking through downtown Seattle in the afternoon rain, knowing that I had finally become exactly who I was meant to be: someone who used financial expertise to protect ordinary families from institutions that prioritized profit over people. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Saw the news about Meridian Global on television. Are you okay?" "I'm perfect," I texted back, For the first time in 3 years, I'm exactly where I belong. The investigation that followed moved with the swift efficiency of federal prosecutors who had been building a case against Meridian Global for months and finally had the evidence needed to pursue criminal charges. My documentation provided the foundation for securities fraud charges that would result in prison sentences for executives who had stolen billions from ordinary investors while maintaining public personas as responsible corporate leaders. Richard Blackstone was indicted on 14 counts of securities fraud, conspiracy to defraud investors, and insider trading that carried potential sentences totaling 40 years in federal prison. The other executives who had participated in the systematic manipulation of financial reports faced similar charges, and several agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. The pension funds that had trusted Meridian Global's financial statements recovered most of their losses through legal settlements, while individual investors who had purchased stock based on fraudulent earnings reports received compensation that helped restore their retirement security. But the outcome that meant the most to me was a letter from Dr. Patricia Chen, thanking me on behalf of the municipal employees whose pension fund had avoided massive losses because I had exposed the fraud before the quarterly earnings announcement could deceive additional investors. You saved thousands of families from financial devastation, she wrote. Teachers, firefighters, and public service workers who dedicated their careers to serving their communities will have secure retirements, because you had the courage to expose corporate fraud that would have stolen their financial future. 3 months after walking into that boardroom, I was working as a consultant for the Securities and Exchange Commission, helping investigators identify patterns of corporate fraud that ordinary auditors might miss. My expertise in financial forensics, combined with my understanding of how information flowed through corporate hierarchies, made me particularly effective at recognizing the kind of systematic deception that Meridian Global's executives had practiced. The work was exactly what I had imagined doing when I graduated from the University of Washington with a thesis on corporate fraud detection. But it was also deeply personal, because every case represented families who trusted institutional systems to protect their economic security, and every successful investigation meant that ordinary people could invest their savings without being victimized by executives who considered public trust a commodity to be manipulated for private gain. My mother's cancer remained in remission, and she had returned to work part-time as a librarian, finding joy in helping students access information and resources that would expand their opportunities for education and personal growth. Her experience surviving cancer with the support of someone who advocated for her medically and financially had given her a perspective on institutional systems that made her particularly effective at helping other families navigate complex bureaucracies. We often talked about how crisis had revealed strengths neither of us knew we possessed, and how survival sometimes required sacrificing who you thought you were for who you needed to become to protect the people you loved. But we also understood that survival wasn't enough when you had the expertise and opportunity to help other families facing similar challenges. My mother's work helping students access educational resources and my work exposing corporate fraud were different expressions of the same principle, that expertise applied with compassion could make the difference between hope and despair for people facing impossible circumstances. One afternoon, as I was reviewing financial documents for a new investigation, my phone rang with a call from Maria Gonzalez, my former colleague from the Meridian Global cleaning crew who was now working as a registered nurse after completing her certification program. "Sophia, I saw the article about you in the Seattle Times," she said. "I can't believe you were working on that investigation the whole time we were cleaning offices together. I couldn't tell anyone what I was doing because I needed to protect the investigation," I replied. "But watching you pursue your nursing degree while working double shifts reminded me that survival isn't enough when you have the education and expertise to help other families facing similar challenges." Maria laughed with the warmth of someone who understood exactly what institutional systems could do to families who didn't have advocates with professional expertise. "Well, now I'm helping families navigate medical crises, and you're helping families protect their financial security. We're both using our education to fight systems that prioritize profit over people." Her words captured something essential about the transformation that had begun 3 years ago when I accepted work as a cleaning professional to pay for my mother's cancer treatment. The woman who had felt like a failure because she couldn't use her financial expertise to build a meaningful career had become someone who used that expertise to protect thousands of families from corporate fraud that would have devastated their economic security. The invisible years spent cleaning offices while executives planned fraud had taught me that real power came not from having a prestigious job title, but from having the knowledge and courage to act when action was needed to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Standing in my new office overlooking Elliott Bay, reviewing evidence of corporate fraud that threatened the retirement security of teachers and firefighters across the Pacific Northwest, I felt something I had never experienced during my years of invisible labor: complete alignment between my education, my expertise, and my sense of purpose. The woman who had once cleaned boardrooms was now someone who belonged in boardrooms, someone whose financial forensics expertise was helping federal prosecutors build cases that would prevent other families from losing their economic security to corporate fraud. But I would never forget the 3 years of invisible observation that had given me access to evidence that ordinary investigators might never have discovered, or the colleagues whose dedication to supporting their families while pursuing their education had reminded me that survival was only the beginning of what people could accomplish when they had the opportunity to use their talents and expertise. The rain that had been falling when I walked out of Meridian Global Industries for the last time had given way to the kind of clear Seattle afternoon that made the Olympic Mountains look close enough to touch. From my office window I could see the Columbia Tower where I had spent 1,000 nights documenting the fraud that would eventually bring down executives who had never bothered to learn my name. Tomorrow I would testify before a congressional committee investigating corporate fraud in the financial services industry. Next week I would begin training federal investigators to recognize the kind of systematic deception that required long-term observation to detect and document. But today, I was simply Sophia Martinez, someone who had discovered that the most devastating betrayals could become the foundation for the most extraordinary transformation, that sometimes the people institutions overlooked were exactly the people who possessed the knowledge and courage to hold those institutions accountable for protecting the families who trusted them. 6 months after walking into that boardroom and watching Richard Blackstone's empire crumble around him, I stood in the Seattle federal courthouse watching him being led away in handcuffs after receiving a 28-year sentence for securities fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. The man who had once commanded boardrooms with arrogant confidence now shuffled past in an orange jumpsuit, his carefully constructed persona as a respected business leader, replaced by the reality of someone who had stolen from thousands of families and would spend the rest of his productive life in federal prison. The courtroom had been packed with investors whose retirement funds had been protected by my testimony, pension fund managers who had avoided catastrophic losses because of the evidence I'd provided, federal prosecutors who had built their case around the documentation I'd collected during 3 years of invisible observation. Judge Patricia Morrison had delivered the sentence with the kind of measured authority that comes from understanding exactly how corporate fraud affects ordinary families who trust institutional systems to protect their economic security. Blackstone, you systematically betrayed the trust of thousands of investors while enriching yourself through information unavailable to the public, Judge Morrison had said during sentencing. Your actions represent exactly the kind of institutional corruption that undermines public confidence in financial markets and threatens the retirement security of working families across this country. As Richard was escorted from the courtroom, he made eye contact with me for the final time, his expression carrying the bitter recognition that he had been destroyed by someone he had never considered worthy of acknowledgement. The woman he had seen emptying his wastebasket every night for 3 years had documented evidence that would keep him in federal prison until he was eligible for Social Security benefits he would never receive because of his criminal conviction. Margaret Williamson, the former board chair who had assumed leadership of Meridian Global during its restructuring, approached me outside the courthouse with the expression of someone who had spent months learning exactly how close her institution had come to complete collapse. The company survived because you had the courage to expose the fraud before it could cause irreversible damage, she said. We've established a corporate integrity program based on your recommendations, and we want to offer you the position of Chief Compliance Officer with complete authority to investigate any suspicious financial activity. The offer was generous and would have provided the kind of prestigious corporate position I had once imagined wanting when I graduated from the University of Washington. But 6 months of working with federal investigators to expose corporate fraud had taught me that my real talent was for protecting families from institutional systems that prioritized profit over people, not for working within those systems to make them marginally more honest. I appreciate the offer, but I've found my calling working with regulatory agencies to identify fraud before it can harm investors, I replied. Corporate compliance is important, but I'm more effective as an independent investigator who can examine companies without worrying about internal politics or executive pressure. Margaret nodded with the understanding of someone who had learned firsthand how corporate hierarchies could prevent people from speaking truth to power when speaking truth might threaten established interests. Well, if you ever change your mind, the offer stands, she said. And if you need references for your consulting work, you can list every board member who was in that room when you walked in and saved us from approving fraudulent financial statements. Walking away from the courthouse, I felt the satisfaction of someone whose work had protected thousands of families from financial devastation while ensuring that executives who had systematically defrauded investors would face consequences appropriate to the scope of their crime. The investigation had recovered nearly $2 billion for pension funds and individual investors, while establishing legal precedents that would make it easier for prosecutors to pursue similar cases in the future. But the outcome that meant the most to me was personal rather than professional. My mother's cancer had remained in complete remission for 8 months, and she had returned to full-time work as a librarian with the energy and optimism of someone who had survived a life-threatening illness and emerged stronger than before. The financial pressure that had forced me to accept work beneath my qualifications had been replaced by consulting contracts that paid more than I had ever imagined earning, while allowing me to use my expertise to protect families facing economic challenges they couldn't navigate alone. That evening, I met my mother for dinner at a restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay, where we could watch the ferries carrying commuters home to communities across Puget Sound while discussing how crisis had revealed strengths neither of us had known we possessed. I saw the news coverage of Richard Blackstone's sentencing, she said, raising her wine glass in a toast. To my daughter, who used her intelligence and courage to protect thousands of families from someone who would have stolen their future. The toast felt like validation not just for the investigation that had brought down Meridian Global's executives, but for the 3 years of sacrifices that had made the investigation possible. Working as a cleaning professional while holding a graduate degree in finance had felt like professional failure at the time, but it had actually been preparation for using my expertise in ways I never could have imagined from within traditional corporate structure. Your experience fighting cancer taught me that survival requires doing whatever is necessary to protect the people you love, even when it means sacrificing who you thought you were for who you need to become. Everything I learned about perseverance and strategic thinking came from watching you refuse to give up when the medical system seemed designed to exhaust patients into accepting inadequate care. My mother smiled with the kind of deep contentment that comes from understanding that crisis can be transformative rather than just destructive when people have the support and resources they need to fight systems that seem impossibly powerful. We both discovered that expertise applied with determination can overcome institutional systems that treat ordinary people as obstacles to profit rather than human beings deserving of dignity and protection, she said. You exposed corporate fraud that would have devastated thousands of families, and I survived cancer that could have killed me. Neither of us could have done it alone. But together we proved that ordinary people can defeat systems that seem designed to defeat them. The conversation reminded me why I had chosen to work as an independent consultant rather than accepting positions within the corporate or regulatory systems I was investigating. My most effective work happened when I could examine institutions from the outside, without worrying about internal politics or career advancement that might compromise my ability to identify fraud that threatened public trust. The following week, I received a call from Senator Elizabeth Warren's office requesting my testimony for a congressional hearing on corporate fraud in the financial services industry. The senator had been following the Meridian Global investigation and wanted my perspective on how regulatory agencies could better detect systematic fraud before it could cause widespread damage to investor confidence and retirement security. Ms. Martinez, we understand that your investigation techniques involved long-term observation and documentation that revealed patterns of fraud that traditional audits might have missed, said Catherine Rodriguez, Senator Warren's chief of staff. We'd like you to explain to the committee how your methods could be applied more broadly to protect investors from corporate deception. The opportunity to influence federal policy based on my experience exposing corporate fraud felt like the natural evolution of work that had begun with cleaning offices while documenting evidence of securities violation. Congressional testimony would allow me to advocate for regulatory changes that could prevent other families from being victimized by executives who considered public trust a commodity to be manipulated for private gain. I'd be honored to testify about fraud detection methods that could protect investors from systematic deception, I replied. But I also want to address how corporate fraud affects ordinary families who depend on honest financial reporting for retirement planning and investment decisions that shape their economic security for decades. Testimony that would explain both the technical aspects of fraud detection and the human cost of corporate deception that treated pension funds and individual investors as sources of profit rather than families trusting institutional systems to protect their financial future. During the preparation period, I was contacted by investigative journalists, academic researchers, and other regulatory agencies who wanted to understand how someone without traditional law enforcement training had been able to document corporate fraud that more experienced investigators had missed. The attention was flattering, but it also reinforced my understanding that my most valuable contribution was practical rather than theoretical. Corporate fraud succeeds when executives believe they can manipulate information without being observed by people who understand financial systems well enough to recognize deception, I explained to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. My background in financial forensics combined with my access to confidential documents created the perfect conditions for identifying patterns of fraud that would have been invisible to investigators without sustained observation of executive behavior. The journalist's article, published 2 weeks before my congressional testimony, described my investigation as an example of how traditional regulatory oversight could be supplemented by innovative approaches that recognized fraud as a pattern of behavior rather than isolated violations that could be detected through periodic audit. 3 days before the hearing, I received an unexpected call from James Patterson, the former CEO of a technology company who had been convicted of securities fraud 5 years earlier and had recently been released from federal prison. Ms. Martinez, I read about your investigation and wanted to congratulate you on exposing the kind of systematic fraud that destroys families while enriching people who should be protecting investor interests, he said. I hope your congressional testimony will help prevent other executives from making the choices that cost me everything and hurt thousands of people who trusted my company. His call reminded me that corporate fraud was ultimately about individual choices made by people who had opportunities to act ethically but decided that personal enrichment was more important than public trust. Richard Blackstone hadn't been forced to manipulate financial statements or deceive investors. He had chosen to prioritize his own wealth over the retirement security of teachers, firefighters, and municipal employees whose pension funds trusted his company's public disclosure. The congressional hearing took place in a packed committee room where senators from both parties questioned witnesses about regulatory reforms that could prevent corporate fraud while maintaining the business flexibility that allowed legitimate companies to compete effectively in global markets. Senator Warren introduced my testimony by explaining how my investigation had protected billions in pension fund assets while demonstrating that fraud detection required sustained observation rather than periodic audits that could be anticipated and circumvented by sophisticated executives. Ms. Martinez, You've shown that some of the most effective fraud detection happens when investigators have access to everyday corporate communications and decision-making processes that executives don't expect to be scrutinized, Senator Warren said. How can regulatory agencies apply your methods more broadly without creating excessive compliance burdens for legitimate businesses? My testimony focused on the distinction between fraud detection and fraud prevention, explaining how systematic observation of corporate behavior could identify patterns of deception that traditional audits might miss, while focusing enforcement resources on companies that posed the greatest risk to investor confidence. Senator, corporate fraud typically involves patterns of behavior that develop over months or years before resulting in the kind of systematic deception that threatens investor confidence, I explained. Early detection requires understanding how information flows through corporate hierarchies and recognizing when executives begin treating public disclosures as tools for managing stock prices rather than honest communications with shareholders. The committee was particularly interested in how my financial education had allowed me to recognize fraud that might have been invisible to investigators without specialized training in corporate accounting and securities law. The most dangerous fraud happens when executives use sophisticated knowledge of financial regulations to manipulate public disclosures in ways that technically comply with reporting requirements while deceiving investors about the company's actual financial condition. I continue. Detection requires investigators who understand both the letter and the spirit of financial regulations and can recognize when technical compliance is being used to facilitate substantive deception. Senator Mike Crapo, the committee's ranking Republican member, asked about the balance between fraud detection and business privacy, noting that excessive regulatory scrutiny could discourage legitimate business innovation and economic growth. Senator, my investigation focused specifically on information that executives deliberately made available through their own communications and documentation practices, I replied. Effective fraud detection doesn't require invasive surveillance of legitimate business activities, but it does require paying attention when executives create patterns of behavior that suggest systematic efforts to deceive investors about material business conditions. The hearing lasted 4 hours and covered everything from technical regulatory procedures to the human impact of corporate fraud on families who trusted institutional systems to protect their retirement security. My testimony was well received by senators from both parties, who recognized that investor protection required both effective enforcement and innovative approaches to fraud detection that could adapt to evolving deception techniques. Following the hearing, I was approached by representatives from several regulatory agencies who wanted to discuss consulting contracts that would involve training investigators to recognize patterns of corporate fraud that traditional auditing methods might miss. Patricia Chen, who had testified on behalf of pension fund managers, joined me for lunch after the hearing to discuss how my investigation techniques could be applied to protect institutional investors from systematic fraud that threatened beneficiary retirement security. Your work demonstrated that some of the most effective fraud detection happens when investigators understand both financial systems and human behavior, she said. Pension fund managers need to identify potential fraud before it can cause catastrophic losses to retirement benefits that working families depend on for economic security. The conversation led to a consulting contract that would involve training pension fund analysts to recognize early warning signs of corporate fraud while developing investigation protocols that could be implemented without compromising legitimate business operations. 2 months after my congressional testimony, I was working with 3 federal agencies and 12 institutional investors to develop fraud detection programs based on the methods I had used to expose Meridian Global's systematic deception. The work was exactly what I had imagined doing when I chose to study financial forensics, but it was also deeply personal because every successful investigation protected families from corporate fraud that would have devastated their economic security. My mother had returned to full-time work and was volunteering with cancer support groups, helping newly diagnosed patients navigate medical systems that could seem overwhelming to people facing life-threatening illnesses for the first time. Her experience surviving cancer with the support of someone who advocated for her medically and financially had given her insights into institutional systems that made her particularly effective at helping other families develop strategies for managing complex healthcare bureaucracy. We often discussed how crisis had taught us that survival required using every resource and skill available, even when those resources came from unexpected sources or required sacrificing conventional ideas about professional success and personal dignity. Your 3 years of invisible observation taught you more about corporate fraud than most investigators learn in decades of traditional regulatory work, my mother said during one of our weekly dinners. My 18 months of cancer treatment taught me more about healthcare advocacy than most patients learn because I had someone fighting for me who understood both medical systems and financial systems. Her observation captured something essential about the transformation that had begun when I accepted work as a cleaning professional to pay for her cancer treatment. The expertise I had developed in financial forensics became most valuable when combined with access to information that traditional investigators couldn't obtain. Just as her knowledge of library science became most valuable when applied to researching treatment options and insurance regulations that could affect her survival. The evening news was reporting that 4 more Meridian Global executives had been convicted of conspiracy and fraud charges based on evidence I had provided, with prison sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. The total recovery for defrauded investors now exceeded $3 billion, making it one of the largest securities fraud cases in Pacific Northwest history. But the outcome that meant the most to me was a letter from Miss Pedersen, whose 12-year-old son's kidney condition I had helped navigate through insurance bureaucracies during my final weeks at Seattle Children's Hospital. "Dear Sophia," she wrote, "I saw the news about your work exposing corporate fraud and wanted you to know that you saved our family twice. First, you helped us get insurance coverage for medical treatment that saved my son's life. Then, your investigation protected our pension fund from fraud that would have devastated our retirement security. You've shown that one person with expertise and courage can protect thousands of families from systems that seem designed to defeat ordinary people." Reading her letter, I realized that the 3 years I had spent feeling like a professional failure because I couldn't use my education to build a traditional career had actually been preparation for using my expertise in ways that protected families from institutional systems that prioritized profit over people. The woman who had once cleaned boardrooms now belonged in boardrooms, but as someone who represented families affected by corporate decisions rather than someone seeking personal advancement within corporate hierarchies. My consulting work allowed me to investigate companies from the outside without worrying about internal politics or career considerations that might compromise my ability to identify fraud that threatened public trust. Standing in my office overlooking Elliott Bay, reviewing evidence of corporate fraud that threatened the retirement security of teachers and firefighters across 3 states, I felt something I had never experienced during my years of invisible labor: complete alignment between my education, my expertise, and my sense of purpose. The rain that had been falling during my final walk out of Meridian Global Industries had given way to the kind of clear Seattle morning that made Mount Rainier look close enough to touch. From my window, I could see the Columbia Tower where I had spent 1,000 nights documenting the fraud that had eventually brought down executives who had considered me beneath notice. My phone buzzed with a call from Maria Gonzalez, who was now working as a charge nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital while completing her master's degree in pediatric nursing. "Sophia, I wanted to thank you for showing me that education and expertise become most powerful when they're used to protect families who can't protect themselves," she said. "Your investigation inspired me to specialize in helping immigrant families navigate medical systems that can seem impossible to understand without professional advocacy." Her words reminded me that the most important transformation hadn't been my transition from cleaning professional to fraud investigator, but my understanding that expertise applied with compassion could make the difference between hope and despair for families facing institutional systems that seemed designed to defeat ordinary people. Today, I would meet with federal prosecutors to provide evidence for another securities fraud investigation. Tomorrow, I would train pension fund analysts to recognize patterns of corporate deception that threatened beneficiary retirement security. Next week, I would testify before a state legislative committee about regulatory reforms that could protect investors from systematic fraud. But every investigation, every training session, and every testimony was ultimately about protecting families who trusted institutional systems to safeguard their economic security, while ensuring that people with the expertise to recognize fraud had the resources and authority to expose it before it could cause widespread damage. The woman who had once felt invisible in corporate corridors was now someone whose work protected thousands of families from executives who had learned to fear her ability to recognize deception that other investigators might miss. The expertise that had once seemed worthless in a world that valued credentials over capability was now the foundation for work that had recovered billions of dollars for defrauded investors, while establishing legal precedents that would protect future generations from corporate fraud. Walking home through downtown Seattle, after another day of using financial forensics to protect families from institutional corruption, I carried with me the satisfaction of someone who had discovered that the most devastating challenges could become the foundation for the most meaningful work, and that sometimes the people institutions overlooked were exactly the people who possessed the knowledge and courage to hold those institutions accountable for protecting the families who trusted them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.